Hey there.
Hi, how are you? You still sound like you're just getting your voice back.
I am just getting my voice back, and it was gone for a long time.
Wow.
I've never had allergies this bad before.
Yeah,
Um,
it's pretty
but
bad this year.
apparently, the tree pollen is like at an all-time high.
I,
So,
I can believe it. I've come out of my house and the windshield of my car was just
yes,
yellow.
yes. Oh, yes. Same here. It's disgusting. But all right, let's jump in. Welcome to Goodnight, Mr. Holmes, a podcast about the Granada Sherlock Holmes, which ran on ITV in the UK between 1984 and 1994, and ran on Masterpiece Mystery in the US around the same time. I'm Laura,
And I'm Rachel.
and today we are looking at episode 14 in the series, which is called The Priory School. And
First published in Collier's in 1904.
it's a short story, but it's a dense episode.
Yeah, it is.
There's a lot here to unpack. Um, so we start out, Mrs. Hudson's at the door of Holmes and Watson's apartment, saying there's a gentleman downstairs, but Watson is shushing her. So she hands him a calling card, which he puts in the pocket of a sleeping Holmes. Holmes opens his eyes, he glances at it, and then he goes back to sleep, or would have, except there's a crashing at the door, and a wild-eyed man with a lovely tie pin wobbles in and faints.
Looks like a young Gene Wilder at this point.
Yes, yes, exactly. Holmes looks at the man with evident delight.
Like, whoa, this is an interesting start to a case.
And then we're at a church listening to a boys' choir sing. It's a funeral mass. And I was like, okay, what's up with that? I think it's just, yeah, yeah. The verses that they're singing, the Latin, it comes from the funeral mass.
Oh, wow.
I couldn't figure out if it was Verdi, if it was Thomas Tallis. I mean, I just couldn't figure out which funeral mass it was, but they all have the same lyrics. And we see our fainting friend in a cap and gown in the pulpit. There are small scenes of boys doing schoolwork, a pair of soccer cleats that are dangling, and a framed photo of a boy with his parents.
Yeah, none of them in the picture look happy, but that's not unusual in photos of that time because of the long exposure time that was needed to capture
Yeah,
them.
you can't hold up a smile for that long. Watson brings the fainting man around with his usual remedy, brandy.
Mhm.
Mrs. Hudson is preparing a little food for the man, and the man rises up and is confronted by a smiling Holmes.
Yeah, he asks for a biscuit and a glass of milk, which, I mean, that's basically milk and cookies, right?
Yes, yes, yes. So this actor, his name is Christopher Benjamin, and he only passed away this January at the age of 90. And he was involved in a lot of Doctor Who productions, and he played Potter in Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner. And his list of credits on IMDb just seemingly goes on forever. But in this case, he's playing the principal or the headmaster of the Priory School, which is presumably an Eton College sort of place. And his name is Dr. Huxtable.
Yeah, in my notes, I just refer to him as Cliff.
I'm sorry.
I just refer to him as Cliff in my notes.
That's funny. This is a better Dr. Huxtable than that one
Yes,
was.
it is.
And Holmes says while the man was in his fainting fit, he, quote, took the liberty of searching your person. I hope you will forgive me. And Huxtable does because he is in awe of Holmes. So Holmes then does his Holmes thing. Huxtable's watch, normally pristine, had a brand new scratch on it, the result of being in the same pocket with coins, the stern habit of a lifetime trampled underfoot, a small occurrence perhaps, but only small, I think, in the way that a vibrating needle may signal an earthquake. The state of your beard demonstrates a disruption to your routine 3 days ago. And Huxtable agrees and begs Holmes to come to Mackleton, which is the town where the Priory School is located. And that's north, like up in the Yorkshire area.
Yeah, is Mackleton an actual town?
I didn't even look to see.
I looked and didn't really get anything.
There's a Mickleton
Yeah,
that's seems to be, uh, yeah, in the Midlands.
Yeah, which is not where this school is.
No, this is way up in Yorkshire. Okay, so Holmes says, I regret. Dr. Watson and I are extremely pressed at the moment.
And Watson looks at him like, we are.
He's like, I've got this case, and Dr. Watson is run off his feet by a recent epidemic of scarlet fever, which is news to doctors.
Yeah,
What?
scarlet fever. I had to look this up because I've heard of scarlet fever, but I didn't actually know what it was. It's a type of strep bacteria
Yes. Yes.
that can be treated with antibiotics, but that wasn't really discovered until the 1920s.
Right.
It has a high rate of mortality. And as of 2023, cases in the US are climbing.
Of course they are.
Of course they are. Approximately 1,500 to 3,000 people in the US die yearly from scarlet fever, according to the American Society for Microbiology in a post written in 2023.
Wow.
They're also climbing in the UK. Between September and November 2022, there were 4,622 cases reported in England, up from the previous 5-year average. So the average for each year for the previous 5 years of 1,294. So that's a big increase.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we know the usual culprits.
Yes, we do.
People not taking stuff seriously. Yeah, I bet that's going to be the next thing, is swearing off antibiotics because they're government controlled or whatever. And Holmes is like, only a very important issue could call us away. And Huxtable is offended. Important. I dare say you've heard of the Duke of Holdernesse. And Holmes is immediately interested. The former cabinet minister, Watson says, and Holmes says, more than that, the letters after his name are almost half the alphabet, one of the greatest subjects of the crown. One of the greatest and possibly one of the wealthiest. Huxtable says he is also, I'm proud to say, and he really is proud to say, my neighbor. Holdernesse Hall, he says, is across the valley from the school. And then we zoom in on this extremely large country house. In real life, it's the facade of Chatsworth House, which is the seat of the Dukes of Devonshire.
Oh, wow.
And the former Deborah Mitford of the Mitford sisters was the Duchess of Devonshire, and she spent a lot of time renovating and restoring it starting in the 1950s. Originally, the house was meant to go to Deborah's older brother-in-law, who was married to Kathleen Kennedy of the Kennedys, known as Kit Kennedy. But he was killed in action during the war, and she died in a plane crash. So, and that's the exterior. The interiors, which are sumptuous,
Yes,
are filmed at a mansion called Lyme Park, which is now owned by the National Trust, but was originally the seat of the Ley family, which held the barony of Newton. Most of the interior design that we see was done in the 1720s by Giacomo Leone, who's a Venetian architect who was tasked with transforming the mansion from Elizabethan style to Palladian style. And it is really something. I mean, these interiors are just polished wood everywhere. And
polished wood, velvet.
Yeah.
They're beautiful.
Also of note, the man playing the Duke of Holdernesse is Alan Howard, and one of his great roles was the voice of the Ring in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Holmes points out that Huxtable's neglected to say what the crime actually is, and it turns out the Duke's son, Lord Salter, has been kidnapped.
And before he says that, the Duke is a solitary man, hates publicity, but he's going to write a check for £5,000 to see the matter resolved. So that's 517,858 £517,858 today. And offering an additional £1,000 to see justice done. That's £103,571 today.
That's
and then Holmes says, okay, what happened?
Right. Tell me what the deal is. And so he says Lord Salter's been kidnapped, and Holmes says, from the Priory School, where he was in your care, very pointedly. And Huxtable looks stricken, and he confirms. And Holmes asks why Huxtable waited 3 days before coming to him, and Huxtable says, His Grace has a deep horror of his family unhappiness being dragged before the world. And we learn later
British
that,
tabloids are
yes, they
a
haven't
lot.
changed at all
Yeah.
in over a century. So the police actually have been hamstrung because of this fear of publicity, and they cannot solve the case. And Holmes says the handling of this case has been deplorable, and Huxtable concurs. And Holmes asks about the demand for ransom, and Huxtable says there hasn't been any. And the boy was not alone in his flight. The German master, named Herr Heidegger, is also missing, as is his bicycle.
If this were happening today, there would be a clear implication of grooming and sex abuse. But this is 1904, so it's just perplexing.
Right. um, God, you think about all those choir boys at the beginning of the episode. So Watson asks why there's been no ransom demand, and Huxtable doesn't answer this question.
I mean, the better question would be, how do you abduct a healthy boy and get the two of you away using only a bicycle?
Right. Huxtable says Heidegger came to the school with the very best references, and Holmes asks if there's any other bicycle missing. Huxtable says no, and Holmes says, do you really mean to suggest that this German master rode off on a bicycle in the night, bearing the boy in his arms?
Yeah.
And Huxtable says no, and Holmes snaps, then what is the theory in your mind? And Huxtable basically says he thinks that the bike is a red herring, and that the German master may have hidden it somewhere and they went off on foot. And Holmes points out, surely there would have been two bicycles if he wanted to give that impression. So Holmes is intrigued, tells Watson to send for a cab immediately and pack, and they'll catch the night train at St. Pancras, come up to the school. Perhaps the trail is not so cold that the two old hounds like Watson and myself may get a sniff of it.
Yeah. According to Wikipedia, the St. Pancras station was constructed by the Midland Railway to connect the extensive rail net, I'm quoting from Wikipedia, to connect its extensive rail network across the Midlands and north of England to a dedicated line into London.
It is now also the place where you can catch the Eurostar to go in what they used to call the channel, the Channel Tunnel. Yeah, and I've taken that.
Yeah, so
it's very fast.
Yeah, it is.
But yeah, St. Pancras. Oh, it's this massive brick building. It's got a great brasserie inside, and there's just nothing like having a glass of champagne in St. Pancras while the trains are coming and going. It's amazing. There's a big statue of John Betjeman's there. He was a poet laureate in the 60s. Anyway, so Watson disappears down the stairs. Holmes heads to his room to pack. He says, I imagine the arrival of Lord Salter at your school must have been a feather in your cap. And Huxtable says, this is a very funny scene. My proudest moment ever since Blackwell's published Huxtable's Sidelights on Horace. You may have heard of it.
Nope.
Very puffed up. And Holmes just says, no, how old is the boy? Running right past Horace. The boy is 9. He's been at the school since after Christmas, winter term, which starts after the New Year. He's an unusual boy, Huxtable says. He was unhappy because the Duke's marriage had not been amicable and the parents separated the previous year, and the Duchess has returned to her father's palazzo in Venice. And Holmes asks how he knows about this since the Duke is so secretive. Huxtable says he's had some confidential talks with Mr. Wilder, the Duke's secretary. He has been most helpful. Holmes also says, I suppose it's been established that the boy is not with his mother in Italy.
And that's where I'd have gone. Palazzo sounds like,
yeah,
like
exactly.
that's where I would go.
If I was running away, yeah.
Exactly.
Holmes says, Huxtable says, yeah, he's not there, and that I cannot tell you what a relief it is to meet you. He's still starstruck.
Mm-hmm.
And Holmes
interrupts him while he's doing his starstruck thing with his call up, Mrs. Hudson. Like Holmes has just been packing the whole time.
Yes.
Bag, and like he's barely listening to this man.
No. And Mrs. Hudson arrives with a very large wicker hamper saying, your picnic, sir. And Holmes says, Mrs. Hudson, however did you guess? And she just says, experience, Mr. Holmes. So Holmes says the two doctors can picnic away on the train, and even he might find himself hungry, which never happens, due to a few days in the bracing atmosphere of the Peak Country. So we skipped the train journey. We're in a wagon heading from the station to the school. Huxtable says that the school is the most select preparatory school in England. He cites a few aristocratic parents who've sent their sons there. As they get out of the wagon and go into the building, the students in pinstripe trousers and actual Eton jackets saying salvete discipuli, which is Latin for greeting students. So, they're getting their Latin drummed into them. Holmes immediately proceeds to Lord Salter's room and sees the photograph of the boy with his parents on the table, along with an envelope.
Yeah, this is the room from the opening montage.
Yep. Along with an envelope that had contained a letter from his father, but no one can find the letter. So Huxtable concludes the boy must still have it.
Yeah, he says it arrived on the morning of the boy's disappearance, which, personally, I would think that would be a crucial clue.
You would think. Holmes then goes to the room next door.
Well, he asks if the boy had received one from Italy.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
The headmaster, I really just have him in my notes as clip, says, no, not recently.
Okay. So
I'd be thinking runaway right about now.
Right, because his mom hasn't been in touch.
Yep.
So then Holmes goes next door. There are two students studying on their beds, and I guess Lord Salter had the privilege of a single room. He doesn't have a roommate. Yeah. Watson approaches one of them and says, I suppose you're the sort of chap who could sleep through a thunderstorm. And the other student says, I don't think he would, sir. And Holmes says, okay, why not? And the boy says, there's a mouse in the wainscoting, and it wakes us both up. So Watson says, any noise from the boys' room? And this kid says, well, there wasn't, except for the door that creaks. We always hear the door. Holmes says, on the night of the disappearance, you didn't hear anything. And the boy says, no, sir, we couldn't even hear the crying. And Holmes is like, crying? And the boy says, he sometimes cries, sometimes. And he seems very anxious not to give the impression that Salter is a crybaby. So Holmes just abruptly walks out of the room.
Yeah, it leaves Watson to say thank you.
Exactly. The Duke arrives at the school in a grand carriage with his family crest on it. Meanwhile, Holmes is looking out over the countryside and getting a sense of things and telling Huxtable the trail's gone cold. And a teacher comes running up to fetch Huxtable to go see the Duke. And Huxtable, he's basically in service to the Duke. He's like, he drops everything, ready to rush off. And he sees that Holmes is in no particular hurry. And he says, the Duke is waiting, Mr. Holmes. And Holmes says, that will never do, kind of sarcastically. Like, he's not wowed by titles and aristocratic lineage, whereas Huxtable very much is. He's a huge snob. So the Duke and his secretary, Mr. Wilder, are in Huxtable's office. The Duke is in this sort of, what do you call it?
Alcove?
Yes, alcove, staring out the window. And Wilder says the Duke is surprised to see that Huxtable invited Holmes to investigate without consulting him. And Huxtable said, well, I heard the police had failed. And Wilder said, it is by no means certain the police have failed. And reminds Huxtable that the Duke is anxious to avoid publicity, blah, blah, blah. And the Duke keeps staring out the window, apparently content to let Wilder do all the talking.
Yeah.
Like, he's too grand to even say a sentence. Huxtable says that he can send Holmes and Watson back to London in the morning, but Holmes says, hardly that. I enjoy your invigorating northern air. I shall spend a few days on your moors. Who knows if I may at least find Herr Heidegger's bicycle, if nothing else. And the Duke is annoyed at this, and he says, this is not a trivial matter, Mr. Holmes. And the two of them stare at one another for a moment. And finally, Holmes says, I'm gratified, yet you think not, Your Grace. And if there was meaning in that remark, Mr. Holmes, I'm afraid it escaped me. Your only child has disappeared, says Holmes. Your hopes, your future, your noble family is threatened with dissolution.
He does not say your beloved son, so it's clear he knows what he's dealing with.
Yes. Yeah, no, the only reason to have kids is to carry on the family name.
Yep.
Love is beside the point.
Yep.
I ask Your Grace, what modesty to this? what is modesty to this, to your child's life? What is reputation? I mean, again, pointing out, do you not love your son? And the Duke says, but then it might be replied, what is continuance without honor?
Most of the aristocracy, I would think.
Right. However, I believe you were largely in the right. If you refer to the restraints I have placed on the activity of the police, then perhaps I have imposed too much. I have a morbid fear of the public gaze, which
again, English tabloids are awful.
Yes. So he turns to Wilder and says, it would be foolish not to avail ourselves of Mr. Holmes' services now that he's here. And the Duke invites Holmes and Watson to stay at Holdernesse Hall. Holmes declines, saying, for the purposes of my investigation, it would be wiser for me to remain here at the scene of the mystery, which makes sense. The Duke says that he and Wilder will be available to answer any questions. And immediately Holmes has one. He says, might I ask whether you formed any explanation as to the mysterious disappearance of your son? And the Duke says, no, sir, I have not.
I have no imagination, sir.
At all. And he and Wilder leave. Holmes then goes down to the classrooms, and the teacher who had summoned them to see the Duke is named Aveling, and Holmes asks how long Lord Salter had been in his class. And Aveling says, since he arrived. Did he speak much of his family? Asks Holmes. Not much. It's my belief he missed his mother, but there was something of his father's reticence in him, you understand, says Aveling. And Holmes asks if he talked about the separation of his parents. And Aveling says, not really. It's a little mysterious. He said the Duke and Duchess loved each other very much. And Holmes says, you don't think that could be whistling in the wind to cheer himself up? And Aveling says, no, he's a very realistic child. Ah, but not a very realistic family, responds Holmes. My research shows that they once provided a member of the Hellfire Club. So, some salacious history.
I'm here.
The Hellfire Club is the name of a number of different aristocratic clubs for quote-unquote society rakes. And the main one was in the town of Wickham, in an abandoned monastery.
Because of course.
Even then, the activities of the club moved out into a series of tunnels and man-made caves. And Benjamin Franklin was actually a visitor on at least one occasion.
I believe that.
Yeah, right? He was an old goat.
Yeah, he was a partier.
These noblemen would partake in vaguely pagan rituals. And their motto was, do what thou wilt, which Aleister Crowley later adopted. And
yeah,
the motto of
you want to be careful with that kind of motto because it's kind of
So basically, it was a sex and drinking club where aristocratic men would carry on with local town girls. And, obviously suspecting it's not fully consensual. And these caves in real life are now a tourist attraction. And they were featured in an episode of Midsummer Murders. And
there's the whole thing is sort of hinted at in Dead Poet Society.
Yeah. It was basically a club for orgying.
Yeah.
And I believe that this episode was partially filmed in those limestone caves.
Oh, no, that's where the ending sequence is?
Sorry?
Is that where the ending sequence is?
Yes.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, they're still there. And there are, they're part of film sets all the time. So Holmes asks, you wouldn't know what time Herr Heidegger retired to his room on the night of the disappearance. And Aveling says, not really. Quite late, after 11. He was duty round master that night, basically seeing that all the boys were properly in bed and nobody was having picnics. And Holmes says, you're a cyclist, I believe. And Aveling says, oh, yes. And he's very enthusiastic. And Holmes asks, did Lord Salter ever accompany you? No, Aveling replies, he's not yet able to retain his balance. And Holmes says, you wouldn't happen to know the make of the tires on Herr Heidegger's bicycle? And Aveling says, certainly, a lovely bicycle, by the way, made in Bremen. The tires were Palmer. The ones with
the longitudinal
tread.
Palmer tires were the company obviously created tires in England. The company was formed in 1895.
And Holmes says, I know the ones. And he just walks away. So later, Watson arrives at the room where they're both staying, and Holmes is looking at like a hand-drawn map of the area and says, this case grows upon me, Watson. There are decidedly points of interest in connection with it. Look at this map. There are certain geographical features which may have a great deal to do with this investigation. And they go over the map. And Holmes asks Watson what he discovered from the police. Watson says that the police have a lot of reports of a man and a boy seen together, but none of them resembled Lord Salter and Herr Heidegger. Excellent, says Holmes. The mass of mistaken sightings confirms my suspicion. I don't believe they used the road. And Watson's like, but, the bicycle. A good cyclist does not need a road, Watson. The moor is intersected with paths. And remember, the moon was at the full. It is to the north that our quest must lie. And then he notes, dinner is soon. That's but first he wants to investigate Herr Heidegger's room. We don't see that investigation. We're now at dinner at the top table with Huxtable and some of the teachers. And Watson's talking and entertaining the table while
with funny stories about the Duke's family origins.
Yeah, exactly. While Holmes is smoking his pipe and creating a great deal of smoke in the room. Watson says, like many ancient lines, it sprang from a very muddy source. Not to be too delicate about it, but they were cattle thieves. and Huxtable looks appalled.
It was the basis of their wealth. That was how they began. That was how they started their fortune.
A warrior class, ingenious, daring, but the basis of their wealth was running off with other people's cows. Watson says, Holmes even tells me that Holdernesse has furnished one of the matter members of the Hellfire Club. And then Holmes then turns to Huxtable and he says, what's the matter? And Huxtable says, it is nothing. And he looks very disgruntled and very jowly. Like his jowls are like really puffed out at this point. Holmes says, oh no, it's clearly something. I expect too much. It is a fault, I'm sure, says Huxtable. Tell us your expectations, said Holmes. And Huxtable gets like really righteous at this point. I do not expect miracles. I am not a man who demands the miraculous, but you have discovered nothing. We've advanced not a jot since the moment we left London. Although that is indeed not true, you have discovered two things, both falsehoods. One, a squalid piece of gossip, and the other, an apocryphal and insulting fantasy about the origins of my great patron. So he's deeply offended. I did not employ you to come here and blacken the name of the Holdernesses, Mr. Holmes. And Holmes says, calm yourself, Dr. Huxtable. We have advanced some way. I can, for example, describe to you in detail what took place at the school on that fateful night. And Watson's looking at Holmes because clearly Holmes hasn't told him anything.
And he can explain the behavior of the excellent and faithful German teacher.
Exactly. Yes. Faithful. Heidegger. What, sir? Says Huxtable. Holmes takes Huxtable to Heidegger's room, and now they do this sort of pantomime. Herr Heidegger retired to his room after 11. He was duty master that night. Now my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, will impersonate. And Watson appears carrying a candle and enters Heidegger's room. He says,
so we don't know where in the north of England the school is, since we're pretty sure the town doesn't exist. But I looked up when electricity came to Yorkshire.
Yeah.
And while there was intention to establish electricity in Yorkshire in 1901, it's very likely that it hadn't manifested by the time the story was written.
Okay, yeah, that explains all the candles.
Yeah.
Because the candles play a big part in this.
Yep. Yeah, I was curious about that.
So Holmes says, Heidegger has at least 2 hours of work ahead of him, and it's been a long day. We see there's an open, extremely large cigarette case on the table. It's the size of a humidor, and an ashtray filled with cigarette butts. He allows himself the comfort of removing his jacket, Holmes continues. He moves across to the chest by the door and pours himself a glass of sherry, badly needed fortification for the task that lies ahead. And it should be noted that Watson is acting all of this out and drinks the sherry.
Yeah, but I have listened to my dad grading papers. My dad was a university professor, and I can believe that your grading exercise books where the students are writing compositions in a different language, you're probably going to need a drink.
Yeah. Sure. And Holmes says he collects the candle, moves to his desk to correct 22 exercise books, and we see them all piled up, which contain not only grammatical exercises, but also a lengthy composition. So yes, a drink is definitely in order. You see my point, Dr. Huxtable. It would be well after midnight if he had done nothing else when his candle fails him. And Watson dutifully blows out the candle. The candles are kept in a chest by the door. Holmes is still narrating. He rises from the desk to fetch another one, but cannot seem to find them. So he turns to the window to draw the curtains to see better by the moonlight. As we know, it was a full moon that night. And now we're not seeing Watson's reenactment, but the events as they occurred. Herr Heidegger is a young man with sandy-colored mustache and a beard. And we see the boy climbing out of the window of his room. Across the rooftops in the gate tower, the boy has been waiting for darkness, knowing that his flight must not be observed. Herr Heidegger watches as the boy hurries across the ledge of the roof to keep his prearranged meeting by the river. Sensing the enormity of what was taking place, Heidegger runs to the door, knocking over what remains of his glass of sherry as he goes. And Huxtable looks very chastened, and he says, I see, thank you. It seems I misjudged you. And they're all seated at the table by this point, and Holmes is turning over the broken glass that had held the original drink of sherry, just like turning it over and over again above the candle, the relit candle, as they sit around it. The wisdom of his choice to pursue the boy is questionable, Holmes said. I believe his fate may be sealed. You alarm me, Mr. Holmes. You mean, I hope not, but if my reasoning is correct, then I do fear for him. And the boy? The key to that, Dr. Huxtable, lies out there beyond Drover's Bridge. And Holmes lights a cigarette with the candle. Then we're looking at an eviscerated sheep by the river. Just bones and fleece and not much else. I mean, it's ugh.
Yep.
And Watson says, poor beast. And he notes that the carrion crows are flying overhead. So we're assuming the boy was taken away on horseback, are we not? He says. Certainly, otherwise Heidegger would not have needed a bicycle to pursue them, says Holmes. But the only tracks we found are cattle.
So I guess it would be assumed that a horse had, like, they could see horseshoes on the tracks.
Mhm.
So you could distinguish them from cows' hooves.
Yes, and that becomes very important later. And Watson's completely ignoring that there's a dead sheep who surely must have been making some tracks as well. Holmes races ahead.
But a while ago, because it was picked clean.
Yes. Holmes stops and he yells, a track, Watson, a track. And Watson, I noticed at that point, is carrying not just a map, but his trusty little brandy bottle. Yeah, for what? I have no idea.
It did just occur to me, I think the initial assumption is that the carrion crows were circling because of sheep.
Yes.
But the sheep was picked clean. Like there was nothing left there, so they wouldn't have been circling for that reason. And that does eventually become a clue later on.
Yes. So Watson's like, is it a bicycle track? And Holmes says, certainly, but not the bicycle. I am familiar with 42 different impressions left by tires. Of course he is. This is a Dunlop with a patch on the outer cover. Heidegger's tires or
yeah. Dunlop tires were invented by a man who's a Scottish inventor and veterinarian who created them for his son's tricycle.
Oh.
And the company was formed around 1890-ish.
It still exists, that brand.
Yeah, it does. I had to do a bit of a deep dive to get the history.
Yeah, Goodyear bought them.
Did they really?
Yeah, but they're still Dunlop. They keep the brand separate.
Yeah.
And Holmes says, this is not Heidegger's track. Whose then? Watson asks. Whose indeed, says Holmes, and they race on past a large pile of these moss-covered stones. And Holmes stops and he says, these are Palmer tracks. Heidegger has been this way. And Watson's somewhat out of breath.
Yeah, Watson is me.
Me too, actually, especially now. And says, absolutely extraordinary. Dunlop tracks For 150 yards, they vanish, and Palmer tracks are quite clear, leading to these rocks. They vanish too. Not a sign of a horse anywhere. And Holmes is, meanwhile, posing. Crouched in his deerstalker, his cane resting on his shoulder. He looks dashing.
Mm-hmm.
Watson sort of plops down next to him, huffing and puffing. And Holmes says, Watson, you have a blazing talent for observing the obvious.
Yeah, Watson does not say that Holmes saw Irene Adler open her secret hiding place and then turn and glare at him and was still like, oh, it's fine. She doesn't suspect anything. We'll come back tomorrow. So sometimes you need the obvious pointed out.
Exactly, yes.
I would never let him forget that. My gravestone
no.
read murdered by Sherlock Holmes for not shutting up about Irene.
Absolutely. And Watson gets up again. He's like, should have brought some luncheon. Anyway, what was Herr Heidegger cycling after? Cows. He takes out a map of the area. Presumably, they didn't abduct the child on the back of a cow. And Holmes...
Yeah, I love that look he gives.
Yeah, I froze the screen at that point. Like, Watson's really wasting his time.
Yeah, it's like the squinty side eye.
Yes. And he says, all traces of horses obliterated. On much evidence, the two bicycles have vanished into thin air. Impossible, says Watson. Precisely. It is impossible as we have stated it. Therefore, in some respect, we must have stated it wrong.
It looks like he's sulking.
That's exactly what I wrote down. And Watson points out there's a hostelry, an inn nearby. If they keep on the way they have, they should arrive at it. That's where I'm going to try my luck, Watson says. I'm hungry.
Maybe they'll feed me.
Holmes just keeps staring out over the moor in his sulking, and Watson kind of nudges him. Lunch, of course, my dear fellow. You must be starving. Holmes gets up and he says, observe that map. There's a hostelry about 3 miles in this direction.
And now it's Watson's turn to roll his eyes.
And they head off. We'll need some food if we're to face the Duke of Holdernesse later. And okay, I just need a drink of my tea. Back at Holdernesse Hall, Wilder is opening the mail. And the butler looking on says, nothing? Nothing, says Wilder. I must tell his grace. I suppose they're referring to ransom notes.
Yeah, I assume. This was around the point where I suddenly remembered the rest of the story.
Yeah, right. Wilder goes into what looks like the dining room, though it's hard to tell, and reports to the Duke, apologizing for not having good news. Again, the carvings in the wainscoting are tremendous. There's a lot of brass and gold and some very expensive looking Chinese porcelain, like Ming vases or something, on a nearby table. Meanwhile, Holmes and Watson arrive at the hostelry. They knock, and Watson tries the door, but it's locked. They start to leave, but a man smoking a cigarette and looking very working class, he's carrying a hammer, peers around a corner, and they approach him. Mr. Reuben Hayes, says Watson. How do you know my name, says Hayes, full of suspicion. And Holmes says it's printed over the door. We were looking for some refreshment, says Watson. Are ya? Says Hayes. And we would be obliged if you could furnish it. Would ya? We would, Watson says. You best ask woman, says Hayes, and he disappears around the corner. Watson says, insufferable loud.
Yeah, the woman has her head out a window, and as soon as Holmes and Watson turn to look at her, she pulls back inside.
Yes.
Oh, look, it's the Thénardiers.
Yes, exactly. Master of the house.
Yeah.
If we're going all the way to Holdernesse Hall this afternoon, let us try to hire these unprepossessing beasts, Watson says.
There are a couple of horses next to
the walk past horses. So Hayes appears to have let them into the inn, or Mrs. Hayes has, because they're sat at a table with some beer steins. Hayes wants to know how far they intend to take the horses.
He gives them some cutlery, but he tosses it on the table.
Right. And Holmes says they're going to take him to Holdernesse Hall. You know the way, Holmes says. I worked there for 15 years, Hayes says. He leans over the table, and Watson notices a very nasty set of scratches on his neck. And Hayes says, it's now. And Watson's like, I am a doctor. I very much assure you that it is. You should have it.
It's really not, though.
You should have it attended. How did you come by it? And Hayes says, one of me dogs did it. And Watson doesn't believe him. The scratches are set too far apart, and like he runs his fingers along the dust on the table, and makes tracks with them about the same distance apart.
Mhm.
Hang on, I just lost.
Yeah, so he asks what animal would make such a scratch, and Holmes says probably a descendant of Champion Jack. There was a sign outside with Champion Jack and a rooster.
Yes,
Um,
and Watson
says, go on.
says cockfighting's been illegal for 50 years.
Yeah, animal fighting, such as dog fighting, cockfighting, bear baiting, and badger baiting, according to the RSPCA, was outlawed in the UK in 1835, which puts them ahead of the US. It was done state by state here, with Louisiana being the last state to do so in 2007.
Oh my God. Well, remember Michael Vick, the football player
Oh,
who put into
yep.
jail? Yeah, for pit bull fighting.
Yep. Torturing, from what I can tell. I tried my best to stay away from those stories, but it was
Oh, is that?
I could, yeah, it was everywhere, so I couldn't completely stay away from it. And the little bit that I heard, like it was almost like he was taking pleasure out of torturing these animals.
Yeah.
You,
No, these people are
you
safe.
don't do stuff like this as punishment. Like, you're just a fucking psychopath.
Exactly. And Holmes says, basically, so what? People still do illegal things, even if there's a law against them, especially in the countryside where they can get away with it because there aren't that many people around. Mrs. Hayes then brings in a plate and puts it in front of Watson. And he says, "What have you cooked for me?" Very, anticipatorily. "White pudding, Swedes, and nips," she says. And she's kind of like every bit as surly as her husband.
Mm-hmm.
Swedes are turnips, nips are parsnips, and white pudding is sausage made with oats or butter.
What I read about Swedes actually is that it's a root vegetable, but it's kind of like a cross between a turnip and like a cabbage.
Oh, it's a rutabaga. That's right.
Yeah.
It's not a turnip. Yeah, it's a rutabaga. And Holmes wants to know how it is. And Watson says, "It is disgusting, Holmes." But he keeps eating it. That woman, she's frightened of something. And more than that husband of hers. Deception upon a deception. What is it intended to hide, says Holmes. Deception, says Watson. And Holmes doesn't answer. And next, they're on the horses, riding off to Holdernesse Hall. Holmes discovers his horse is lame. He hops off, examines the hoof, and finds that the horse has old shoes, but new nails. At Holdernesse Hall, while they wait for the Duke, Holmes examines the portraits on the wall, and Watson is looking at this glass-top table with some horseshoes and spurs in it. There's a trace of fabric stuck to the corner that Holmes notices, and he puts it in his pocket. The butler summons them to the library, where Wilder welcomes them and asks if there is news. "There's just one point upon which I need to be satisfied. It concerns the Duke's private correspondence," Holmes says. "As the Duke's private secretary, perhaps I can be of some assistance," says Wilder. "I believe his Grace wrote to his son upon the day this incident occurred," Holmes says. And Wilder corrects him. "No, he wrote the day before." "Yes, but he would have received it upon that day," Holmes says. "Quite probably," says Wilder. "Might have been there have been anything in that letter which would have prompted the boy to run away?" Holmes asks. "I hardly think so," says Wilder. "Anyway, he would have run here, if anywhere." "Or to his mother in Italy," Holmes says. "No, sir," says the Duke, suddenly appearing in the doorway. Lord Salter would have realized the impossibility of achieving such a goal, even if abetted by this German. He is an intelligent, practical child.
He's a practical child, and that's why he ran away. Okay.
"And yet he cries in his sleep," says Holmes. And there's a little bit of an accusation there. "Did his Grace post the letter himself?" he asks Wilder. And Wilder says, "His Grace is not in the habit of posting letters." The letter was on the table with other correspondence, and the butler was the only other person who would have handled them. And the Duke wants to know what progress has been made. "Are you to disappoint me?" And Holmes says, "It's mostly a matter of clarification. My belief is that the boy was tempted out of school by a prearrangement, and I suspect his mother may have been the bait." The German master observed his departure, set off in pursuit. We tracked the passage of his bicycle across the moors with much difficulty. It is almost as if the tracks were deliberately expunged by someone. And here he stops abruptly. He says, by someone driving cattle. You don't happen to know if cattle are on the moor. And the Duke says, what about them? I hope you have seen none. We cannot winter cattle outside in our upland climate. They will not be out of the yard for at least another 2 weeks. And then Holmes murmurs, oh, I've been as blind as a beetle. And as they leave, they're walking, out of the front hall. And Holmes is shouting, old shoes and new nails, old shoes and new nails. And meanwhile, Watson is protesting, Holmes, there's something you should see. It is a remarkable cow that trots, canters, and gallops. Holmes continues, did you see those horseshoes? Watson says, and he's gesturing at that glass top table. I saw them. Marauding powers of Holdernesse shod their horses with cloven horseshoes to escape detection. Reuben Hayes took advantage of a piece of local history.
So cloven horseshoe, what they mean is that instead of an intact horseshoe, it's sort of like one half that was attached to one side of the hoof and one half that was attached to the other side. So you've essentially got two horseshoes on each foot.
Yeah, and it mimics the footprint of a cow. Yep. Because they have cloven hooves. Yep. Horses don't.
Yep.
And that's why horseshoes are like, all the way around. So the horseshoes were meant to look like cow hooves to disguise the marauding.
Yes.
And they're back on horseback. They arrive at the pile of mossy stones. It's bad, Watson, bad, says Holmes. Those vultures to the north mark the spot. And again, we're looking at
which, again,
the carrion
because they couldn't have been the sheep.
Right. And they find the German master dead, lying by his bicycle. And the crows have been at him. Fortunately, they don't show the entire thing, just his hand. After this grisly discovery, Holmes summons a shepherd in the distance. Meanwhile, Watson is examining.
And he does it by just standing on a rock, shouting, hello.
Right, yeah. And
hello.
shaking his
hello. Yes. Be like, hi, I'm going to go back to work now.
Watson's examining under Heidegger's nails, their skin and blood, which Holmes points out is consistent with the scratches on Hayes's neck. Cause of death is strangulation. They dispatch the shepherd to give the news to the school. And Holmes says, we must proceed on foot. I was warm at that inn. Warm, as the children say. The trail grows colder with every step I take away from it.
Kids these days, so.
Yeah. The next scene, it's a man with a bicycle rushing down a path. He drops the bicycle. We then see Lord Salter bound up and sitting on a bed. He's dirty. His collar's torn. Wilder bursts in and says, it's all over now, Arthur. Whatever that means. Holmes and Watson are hurrying to the hostelry and go past the bicycle. It's a Dunlop with a patch on the tire. As they burst inside, someone is yelling, help me, help me. And at first I thought this was the boy, but it's actually Mrs. Hayes. She's bound up and gagged. And as they free her, Holmes asks who came for the boy and deduces that it's Wilder. Mrs. Hayes confirms and said they're headed to Will Buick's cottage on the Chesterfield Road, whoever Will Buick is. Holmes and Watson split up. Holmes is riding Wilder's bike back to Holdernesse Hall. Watson's running towards Will Buick's cottage. Wilder is banging on the door at the cottage, and he's got Lord Salter with him. And Watson is watching all of this from behind a tree. But the door doesn't open. So Wilder grabs the boy by his collar and they race off. At Holdernesse Hall, Holmes is telling the Duke, it's time to write a check for £6,000.
£621,430 today. And he gives his bank info. Here's how you can direct deposit that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I do not possess the temperament, Mr. Holmes, that appreciates the kind of acidulous pleasantry that clearly amuses you. I am sorry, but I do not see how James, Mr. Wilder, could possibly be implicated in this business. A lie. And you have urged no proof of it, says the Duke, indignant. But I do possess the proof. It is beyond the debate. The mud is scarcely dry upon the cloven horseshoes in your casements. I guess the horseshoes were put back. Why do you doubt my word? You seem to suffer from a
Yeah, old
blind.
shoes and new nails. The old shoes were put back on.
Right. Right. The deceptive horseshoes meant to look like cow hooves. You seem to suffer from a blindness to your own interest, which borders on madness. Your Grace, these portraits in the hall of you and your family as young men, there your family lineaments are very clear, says Holmes. How long?
This story has a lot in common with Count of Baskervilles. A
Mhm.
lot of details.
Yeah, well, Conan Doyle wasn't particularly inventive. How long has Mr. Wilder been in your service? And now the Duke is really pissed off. What is your meaning? How dare you, sir? You do not understand. You are a barbarian.
I think it's pretty clear at this point that Holmes does understand.
Yes, yes. I just love that he called him a barbarian when his family comes from cattle thieves. And, then, he's yelling at Holmes, and then he stops abruptly. That is, as I suspected, Holmes says, Mr. James Wilder is your son. And the Duke nods. And he says, basically, when he was young, he was massively in love with this woman. He offered marriage. She refused it because she wasn't good enough for him. And he says, had she lived, I never would have married anyone else, but she died and left this one child, James, who, for her sake, I've tended and cared for. I could not acknowledge paternity to the world, but in all other ways, I've treated him like my son. He has required, but not warranted, a father's forgiveness many times. And I have forgiven, I have forgiven, I have forgiven much.
Yeah, meaning he knows Wilder is a garbage person.
Yes. Oh, your Grace, you have done all you can for Wilder, says Holmes. You must realize he is lost to you. He's conspired to abduct Lord Salter. He's an accessory to murder, however unwittingly. He must be found before he's tempted to a crime even more terrible. He must be found before you lose the son that is left to you. And the Duke gets up and he tugs on the bell pull, summoning Rivers, the butler. He instructs him to gather the household to search the countryside for Lord Salter. If you find Mr. Wilder, please see that he is detained and brought to me. And Watson's racing across the countryside and he trips and he falls down.
Watson is me.
Also me. Wilder, Holmes says, intercepted your letter and substituted a note, which deceived your son into believing he was to see his mother, says Holmes, as the entire household makes its way outside. The murderous Hayes was his paid accomplice, but the police have been alerted. Hayes will not escape. And then Watson bursts in the door, panting. I tracked them on the moor, but they disappeared. He's huffing and puffing. I searched the area, but it's as if the earth just swallowed them up, which in a way it did.
Yes.
Holmes says, with my research into your family history, I seem to recall mention of a huge limestone cavern where the stolen cattle were penned. The cathedral, said the Duke. And we're back.
Call it that.
The Hellfire Club.
Yes.
Wilder, we see, is yanking the boy through the caverns as the
the boy is practicing passive resistance.
Yes, which is probably the best thing he could possibly.
Yeah.
He is a practical child.
he's very young.
He is. He could not be more than 10.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, we could go into boarding schools and cruelty, but so they're making their way through the caverns. The boy is trying to hamper Wilder. The caverns are quite vast, and they find the boy very deep.
They're going through it. The search party is going through this passage where the ceiling is so low that they have to run hunched over,
right,
and the floor, like they're ankle deep in water.
Right. Yes. The boy is sitting on this kind of ridge.
Yeah, he calls out to them if they follow the sound, and then you see them hold their lanterns up high, and the camera pans up to the boy.
And then Wilder's a little further away on kind of a cliff. And then he falls off, dying in the process.
Yeah. The Duke calls out to Arthur, the boy, and Wilder says, no, you shall not have him. Arthur calls out, father. Wilder's like, some father. And then he just like falls over like Professor Moriarty.
Yes, yes, quite like Professor Moriarty. And he whaps his head on the stone and is dead. So then we're back at Holdernesse Hall. The Duke is putting the boy to bed. He's kissing his forehead, which is very unlike him. And he says, I was disposed to love Francesca, not with a boy's passion, but with a man's love. Francesca being Arthur's mother. My marriage to her foundered on James's jealousy. As long as I could see his mother's face and manner in him, James knew he could keep me from the love I owed my wife.
And as he's saying this, we see Arthur being tucked into bed by the Duke, then kisses his forehead.
Yep. Even in his cruelty to Arthur, I could not send him away, even for that. So I sent Arthur away instead. And Holmes asked, what did he hope to achieve by kidnapping his brother? Money? Legitimacy? And the Duke says, power. Power over me. He delighted in exercising power over me, whom he knew to have denied him power. And he's really tired. He's very rueful. Watson points out that the Duke suspected Wilder was behind the abduction, and the Duke agrees.
In my darkest.
Sorry?
In my darkest moments, yes.
Yes. And says he has a long penance ahead, and he hopes that Francesca will forgive him. He then writes Holmes a check, and we see that it's for £12,000.
Oh, I thought it was 13.
Oh, maybe, yeah. It's at least twice what he was supposed
right.
to.
So I looked up 13. If it's 12, then it'll be slightly less than that. But £13,000 is £1,346,433 today. I hope he gives Watson at least some of that money.
Well, Holmes says, this is a king's ransom. And the Duke says, you have given me back my future. And then as the credits are rolling, we see Lord Salter back at school. At first, he's playing happily with his mates, and then he goes and he sits down on these stones.
Yeah. I have to note that playing happily means he kind of runs around in circles until he's tired.
Yeah. And then he sits down, and he looks very pensive. He's not a happy child.
No, he's not.
For good reason.
Yes, I was going to say.
But you can't beat those uniforms, the pinstripe pants and the little crop jackets with the little round collars.
They did look nice.
Yeah. So, any further thoughts on this episode?
So what occurred to me was that we didn't talk about New Watson at the end of the last episode.
We did a little bit at the beginning of it, but yeah.
Yeah, a bit at the beginning. But we didn't go into a whole lot of detail about the differences. And it feels unfair to compare them, but on the other hand, they're playing the same character in the same show, so you
have to. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of have to. So David Burke, what I noticed most about the difference, just aside from the fact that Edward Hardwicke is playing Watson a bit more down to earth, is what a different energy that brings to the entire show.
Yeah.
Because David Burke was sort of trying to match Jeremy Brett's energy, I guess, kind of, almost a wackiness. And, so they sort of matched each other that way. With Edward Hardwicke playing Watson more down to earth, it's more like they complement each other.
It's interesting because according to Bending the Willow, the first episode they shot between Brett and Hardwicke was not The Empty House or this one. It was the Abbey Grange. Yes.
Yeah, because The Empty House, you got the feeling that they knew each other.
Right. But in the Abbey Grange, we're going to notice that Hardwicke doesn't have a lot to do in that show. And the author of this book says, I do not know whether this was a deliberate ploy to help ease him into the series, but it seems to me a plausible explanation.
Yeah, I strongly suspect it was.
Yeah. And we can get into more of what we find in the Abbey Grange when we get to that.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's just interesting, the differences. Like I could see Watson is a former army surgeon during a war. And I have a hard time seeing David Burke as like an everyman kind of person, the way he was playing Watson, because he was so cheerful about it,
yes.
so energetically. But like I could only see it if he was, like some aristocrat who, was just, sending troops off to die and being like, oh, you go do that, Sonny, and I'll just stay here and drink some sherry.
Right. But he wasn't.
No, he wasn't. So I have a hard time putting those two things together. Whereas Hardwicke's Watson, I can easily see as, oh yeah, this guy he's seen a lot and he's had to learn to live with it.
Yeah. Yeah, the PTSD is much more evident in Hardwicke than it is in Burke.
Yeah.
Burke, like you said, yeah, he really seems to be more sort of aristocratic adjacent.
Yeah, he doesn't seem affected by it.
And Hardwicke is an army doctor with his hands dirty.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are good parallels to the characterization of Watson in the BBC Sherlock series. Martin Freeman definitely plays him that way. He's got a dark side.
Yeah, I noticed, especially in A Study in Pink, there are some moments where you can see Benedict Cumberbatch matching some of the physical things that Jeremy Brett would do.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And then he becomes more childish in the next, the rest of the episodes. He becomes this sort of pouty teenager.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like. Well, I mean, and as we've noted before, a lot of Jeremy Brett's energy was due to being bipolar.
Yeah.
And so, these sudden exclamations and leaps into the air is all like that energy from a manic phase.
Yeah. But you can almost see like Cannon Holmes being like that too.
Of course. I mean, well, and perhaps he too was bipolar. Who knows?
Who knows?
Anything else?
Let's see. Do I have anything else? Not really about the episode. So for our listeners, all three of you,
Yes.
There hasn't been a break in the episodes being released because we had several. We were several episodes ahead. We've been through those several episodes now.
Because I had to go away on vacation before I started my new job. You had to go.
I was on vacation. My mother came to visit.
And then I lost my voice.
Yeah. We went to the Camden Aquarium and then cleaned my house because we know how to have fun. So
I went upstate to Kingston and stayed in a Airbnb that is a historic home where Sojourner Truth lived for a few months while she was reclaiming her son out of slavery.
Wow.
It was incredibly cool. I love that town. It's so historical.
Yeah.
There's so much there. But yeah, it was
that sounded like a great vacation.
the getaway I needed before I started this great new job that I actually love. And I never thought working in insurance and financial services would be fun, but damn, it is.
I have an insurance question for you when we're done filming.
I don't know if I can answer it, but if it's about insurance taxonomy, I can.
So in the future, meaning in like 3 weeks, there will probably not be an episode released because we don't have any stored left.
Yes, that is true. And you're going to your mom's, right? Or your family's?
To my parents. Yeah, I'm going to Missouri. My nephew is having his bar mitzvah.
Oh, that's right. Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. It should be fun. I'm looking forward to
it. Okay. Oh, well, what's up on deck next?
So that's all from us this week. If you've enjoyed the show and haven't subscribed yet, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to support us, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends. And join us next week when we'll be discussing The Second Stain.
Ooh, The Second Stain. Love that one.
The story of doing laundry.
Yes. All right, great. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.